The baby gorilla's hands were soaked in fresh blood that wasn't his own, and he was frantically begging Jake to follow him deeper into the African forest. What the Montana cowboy discovered when he answered that desperate plea would force him into a deadly game of survival against armed mercenaries hunting for their final witness. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Jake Carson had never imagined his life would lead him to the edge of the Virunga Mountains in East Africa. But then again, life had a way of taking unexpected turns. At 38 years old, the weathered cowboy from Montana had traded the rolling plains of his homeland for the volcanic highlands of Rwanda, working as a ranch hand at the Silverback Conservation Ranch, a unique facility that combined cattle ranching with gorilla rehabilitation. The transition hadn't been easy. Everything about this place challenged what he thought he knew about working with animals and land. The morning started like any other. Jake rose before dawn, the cool mountain air biting through his denim jacket as he stepped onto the wooden porch of his modest cabin. The acacia trees stood like sentinels in the pale light, their distinctive flat-top silhouettes reminding him he was far from home. He'd grown to love these African mornings, the way the mist clung to the volcanic soil, the distant calls of exotic birds replacing the crows and meadowlarks of Montana. But there was always an ache in his chest, a longing for the familiar that he couldn't quite shake. Jake had come to Africa 3 years ago, running from a past he couldn't face and a future he couldn't imagine. His wife Sarah had died in a car accident, and their ranch, the place where they'd built their dreams together, had become a prison of memories. Every fence post, every barn beam, every corner of that land whispered her name. His sister had shown him the job posting, thinking a dramatic change might save him from the grief that was slowly consuming him. She'd been right in a way. The work here was demanding enough to exhaust him, different enough to keep his mind occupied, and meaningful enough to give him a reason to wake up each morning. The Silverback Conservation Ranch was the brainchild of Dr. Elizabeth Mwangi, a Rwandan primatologist who'd recognized that the local community needed economic opportunities that didn't conflict with gorilla conservation. By creating a working cattle ranch that also served as a buffer zone and rehabilitation center for injured or orphaned gorillas, she'd found a way to make conservation profitable for everyone involved. Jake respected her vision, even if he didn't fully understand the science behind it. What he did understand was hard work, animals, and the land. Those were languages he'd spoken all his life. Before we continue with Jake's extraordinary day, tell us where you're watching from. Have you ever had an encounter with wildlife that changed your perspective? Drop a comment below, and if you're enjoying this story, make sure to subscribe because what happens next will absolutely blow your mind. Jake walked toward the main stable, his boots crunching on the gravel path. The ranch maintained a herd of about 200 cattle, hardy breeds adapted to the high altitude and the unique challenges of farming on the edge of a volcanic mountain range. His job was simple in theory: manage the cattle, maintain the fences, ensure the animals stayed healthy, and the ranch remained profitable. In practice, nothing about working in Africa was simple. There were diseases he'd never heard of, predators that made Montana wolves look tame, and weather patterns that defied everything he thought he knew about ranching. But the most challenging aspect of his job was something he'd never expected: the gorillas. The ranch bordered the Volcanoes National Park, home to some of the last remaining mountain gorillas in the world. Dr. Mwangi's rehabilitation center housed several juveniles and a few adults recovering from injuries or human conflict. Jake had been skeptical at first. He was a cowboy, not a zookeeper. What did he know about primates? Yet over time, he'd developed a grudging respect for the massive creatures. They were intelligent in ways that unsettled him, their eyes holding a depth of emotion and awareness that seemed almost human. The rehabilitation center was separate from the main cattle operation, managed by Dr. Mwangi and her team of veterinarians and wildlife specialists. Jake's interactions with the gorillas were supposed to be minimal, limited to the occasional assist when physical labor was needed for construction or transport. He preferred it that way. The animals made him uncomfortable. They looked at him with too much understanding, as if they could see straight through to the broken parts of himself he tried so hard to hide. As he approached the stable, something felt wrong. The cattle were restless, moving in agitated circles in the far pasture. The horses in the corral were stamping and snorting, their ears pinned back. Jake's instincts, honed by decades of reading animal behavior, went on high alert. Something had disturbed them, and recently. He scanned the tree line, looking for signs of predators. Leopards occasionally came down from the mountains, and there had been reports of a rogue hyena pack in the area. That's when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong to any animal he recognized, yet somehow struck a chord deep in his chest. It was a cry, plaintive and desperate, filled with a fear and loneliness that transcended species. The sound came again, and Jake turned toward its source, his hand instinctively moving to the knife he always wore on his belt. Through the morning mist, he could see movement near the edge of the property, where the ranch land met the wild forest that climbed toward the volcanic peaks. What emerged from the mist stopped him in his tracks. A baby gorilla, no more than 2 years old, was stumbling toward him across the pasture. The little creature was covered in mud, leaves stuck to its dark fur, and it was crying, a heartbreaking sound that seemed too human to come from an animal. But what made Jake's blood run cold was the blood. The baby gorilla had blood on its hands and streaking down its chest. Not its own blood, Jake realized with growing horror. The infant appeared uninjured. This was someone else's blood. Jake stood frozen as the baby gorilla approached, every instinct telling him to be cautious. Mountain gorillas were endangered and protected by law. Any interaction with them, especially young ones, required proper protocol and the presence of trained wildlife specialists, but this infant was clearly in distress, and there was no time to run for help. The little creature stumbled the last few yards, and then did something that nearly broke Jake's heart. It reached up with both arms, the universal gesture of a child wanting to be picked up, wanting comfort and safety. The crying intensified, and Jake could see the terror in those dark, expressive eyes. This baby had witnessed something traumatic, something that had sent it fleeing from its family or troop. Jake had seen that look before, in the eyes of orphaned calves, in the face of his nephew after a bad car accident, in his own reflection during those dark months after Sarah died. It was the look of someone whose world had just shattered, who was desperate for anyone to make things right again. Against his better judgment, Jake knelt down to the infant's level. He spoke softly, using the same calm, steady voice he'd used with spooked horses and frightened cattle all his life. "Easy there, little one. I've got you. You're safe now." The baby gorilla lurched forward and wrapped its arms around Jake's neck with surprising strength. The small body was trembling violently, and Jake could feel the rapid beating of its heart against his chest. He carefully lifted the infant, supporting its weight the way he'd seen Dr. Mwangi's team do with the rehabilitation gorillas. The blood was still wet, still warm. Jake's mind raced through possibilities. Poachers were rare, but not unheard of in this region. Despite decades of conservation efforts and heavy penalties, there were still people who killed gorillas for bushmeat or traditional medicine, or simply because the animals competed with their crops. There were also territorial conflicts between gorilla families, though those rarely resulted in serious injuries. And then there were the most dangerous predators of all, humans with land disputes, logging interests, or political agendas that put them at odds with conservation efforts. Jake turned toward the main house, the baby gorilla clinging to him like a drowning man to driftwood. He needed to alert Dr. Mwangi immediately. Whatever had happened in the forest, it was serious, and there might be injured gorillas that needed help. But before he could take more than a few steps, the infant began making different sounds, urgent grunts and cries that didn't sound like distress. The little creature was pulling at Jake's shirt, trying to turn his body back toward the forest. At first, Jake thought the baby was simply confused or wanted to return to its mother, but there was a purposefulness to the movements that gave him pause. The infant released one hand from Jake's neck and pointed toward the trees, the gesture so human-like that it sent a chill down his spine. Then the crying started again, but this time it had a different quality. Not fear for itself, Jake realized, but fear for someone else. The baby was trying to communicate something, trying to tell him that someone in the forest needed help. Jake's rational mind told him to ignore it. He was a ranch hand, not a wildlife rescuer. The proper protocol was to get the infant to Dr. Mwangi, report what he'd found, and let the trained professionals handle whatever emergency was unfolding in the forest. But there was something in the baby's desperate attempts to communicate, something in those intelligent eyes, that made him hesitate. He'd always trusted his instincts with animals. That sixth sense had saved his life more than once, had prevented injuries to his livestock, had guided him through situations where logic alone would have failed him. The baby gorilla was begging him. There was no other word for it. The little creature was using every means at its disposal to convince Jake to follow, to come see, to help. Jake looked toward the main house, then back at the forest. Dr. Mwangi wouldn't arrive for another hour. Her team was off-site doing field research. The other ranch hands were working the far pastures. If someone was injured or dying in that forest, an hour might be too long. He made a decision that would change everything. "All right, little one. Show me what you need to show me." The moment the words left his mouth, the baby gorilla's demeanor shifted. The frantic crying stopped, replaced by urgent vocalizations that sounded almost like instructions. The infant squirmed in Jake's arms, clearly wanting down but also wanting him to follow. Jake set the little creature on the ground carefully, half expecting it to bolt back into the forest alone. Instead, the baby took a few steps, stopped, and looked back at him with unmistakable impatience. Jake followed, his mind cataloging the risks. He had no radio, no backup, no weapon beyond his knife, and no real idea what he was walking into. The forest ahead was dense, part of the buffer zone that separated the ranch from the national park proper. It was territory he'd been warned to avoid unless absolutely necessary. Mountain gorillas were generally peaceful, but adult males, the famous silverbacks, could be aggressive if they felt threatened. And if there were poachers or criminals in the area, he'd be walking into a dangerous situation completely unprepared. But the baby gorilla was already moving, glancing back every few seconds to ensure Jake was following. The little creature's urgency was palpable, and despite his reservations, Jake found himself drawn forward by a compulsion he couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the 3 years of numbness finally cracking, allowing him to feel genuine concern for another living thing. Maybe it was the cowboy code he'd been raised with, the unspoken rule that you help those who couldn't help themselves regardless of species. Or maybe, in some strange way, this desperate infant reminded him of himself, lost and begging for someone to see his pain and respond to it. They entered the forest, the canopy closing overhead and plunging them into green, filtered twilight. The baby gorilla moved with increasing speed, navigating the undergrowth with an ease Jake couldn't match. He pushed through vines and ducked under branches, his boots finding precarious purchase on the muddy volcanic soil. The sounds of the ranch faded behind them, replaced by the alien symphony of the African forest. Birds he couldn't name, insects that clicked and buzzed, and somewhere in the distance, the low rumble that might have been thunder or might have been something else entirely. Jake had been following the baby gorilla for nearly 20 minutes when the smell hit him. It was a scent he knew too well from his years ranching, the metallic tang of fresh blood mixed with disturbed earth and something else, something acrid that made his eyes water. Gunpowder. His stomach dropped as the implications became clear. Whatever had happened here involved firearms, which meant humans, which meant this situation was far more dangerous than he'd anticipated. The baby gorilla stopped abruptly at the edge of a small clearing and turned back to Jake, its eyes pleading. The little creature made soft, anxious sounds and gestured toward something beyond the dense foliage. Jake approached carefully, every sense on high alert. He could hear labored breathing now, heavy and wet, the sound of lungs struggling against injury. He pushed aside a large fern frond and stepped into the clearing, and what he saw made his blood run cold. A massive silverback gorilla lay on his side in the center of the clearing, his magnificent chest rising and falling in shallow, painful breaths. The animal had been shot at least twice from what Jake could see. One bullet had torn through his shoulder and another had struck his abdomen. Blood pooled beneath the great ape's body, staining the forest floor dark. But what made the scene even more horrifying was what surrounded him. 3 other gorillas, all dead. A female, likely the baby's mother, and 2 juveniles. They'd been killed execution style, shot in the head at close range. Jake's hands clenched into fists as rage and disgust washed over him. This wasn't hunting, this wasn't even poaching in the traditional sense. This was a massacre, a deliberate slaughter of an entire family group. The only survivors were this dying silverback and the baby who had somehow escaped and come looking for help. The little gorilla rushed past Jake to the fallen silverback, making distressed vocalizations and trying to rouse him with gentle touches. The silverback's eyes opened, those deep brown orbs focusing on the infant with unmistakable recognition and love. The great ape lifted one massive hand and touched the baby's head with heartbreaking tenderness. Then those intelligent eyes found Jake, and in them the cowboy saw something that transcended species. A father's desperate plea to protect his child. A dying creature's last hope that this strange human might be different from the ones who had destroyed his family. Jake knelt beside the silverback, his rancher's eye assessing the wounds with grim expertise. The shoulder injury was serious but survivable with proper treatment. The abdominal wound was the real problem. Depending on what organs had been hit, the silverback might have minutes or hours, but without immediate veterinary intervention, he wouldn't survive the day. Jake pulled out his phone, hoping against hope for a signal. Nothing. They were too deep in the forest, too far from the ranch towers. The baby gorilla was crying again, pressing itself against the silverback's chest, and the dying ape wrapped his good arm around the infant in a gesture of protection and comfort. Jake felt his throat tighten. He'd seen similar scenes on his ranch when animals died, the way their young stayed with them, confused and frightened. But this was different. The level of emotional intelligence on display, the obvious grief and fear, the conscious awareness of impending death, it was almost too human to bear. Jake made a decision. He couldn't save the 3 dead gorillas, and he probably couldn't save the silverback either. But he could try. He'd dealt with enough injured livestock to know basic field medicine, and while gorillas weren't cattle, the principles of stopping bleeding and preventing shock were universal. He stripped off his shirt and tore it into strips, working quickly to create pressure bandages for both wounds. The silverback watched him work, occasionally wincing with pain but never trying to stop him. As Jake worked, he talked, the same steady, calm patter he'd used with injured animals his whole life. "All right, big guy, I know this hurts, but I'm trying to help. You did good protecting your family. That baby of yours, he's brave, came all the way to the ranch to get help. We're going to get you out of here, get you to Dr. Mwangi. She's good, really good. If anyone can fix you up, she can." He had no idea if the silverback understood the words, but tone mattered with animals, and he hoped his voice conveyed intention, if not meaning. The bandages helped slow the bleeding, but the silverback needed real medical attention fast. Jake looked around the clearing, trying to determine the best route back to the ranch. Carrying a 400-pound gorilla through dense forest was impossible alone. He'd need help, equipment, possibly a helicopter if they could get one to the area. But first, he needed to get a message out. The ranch had emergency protocols for situations like this, but they all depended on being able to communicate. The baby gorilla had calmed somewhat now that someone was helping, but it stayed pressed against the silverback, occasionally reaching out to touch Jake's arm as if to encourage him to keep working. The little creature's trust was both humbling and terrifying. Jake had no idea if what he was doing would make any difference, but he couldn't just leave them. The cowboy code his father had drilled into him since childhood wouldn't allow it. You didn't abandon the helpless, whether they had 2 legs or 4. A sound in the forest made Jake freeze. Voices. Human voices speaking in a language he didn't understand but recognized as Kinyarwanda. They were coming from the direction he and the baby had come from, which meant they were between Jake and the ranch. The voices grew louder, closer, and Jake caught fragments of conversation. He didn't need to understand the language to recognize the tone. Whoever these people were, they were searching for something or someone. The baby gorilla heard them too and made a sound of pure terror, burying its face against the silverback's chest. The dying ape's eyes met Jake's again, and this time the message was even clearer. Hide. Protect the baby. Don't let them find him. Jake's mind raced through options. 3 dead gorillas and 1 dying silverback meant whoever was out there had no qualms about killing. If they found Jake as a witness, they'd likely kill him too. And they'd definitely finish off the silverback, and probably the baby as well. Jake scooped up the infant gorilla despite its protests and moved quickly to the far side of the clearing, tucking them both behind a massive fallen log covered in moss and ferns. He held the baby close, one hand gently covering its mouth to muffle any sounds. The little creature trembled in his arms but seemed to understand the need for silence. Through gaps in the foliage, Jake could see the silverback, still lying where he'd fallen, his chest rising and falling in increasingly shallow breaths. 3 men emerged into the clearing and Jake's blood turned to ice. They were armed with automatic rifles, military-grade weapons that had no legitimate purpose in a conservation area. The men wore a mixture of military fatigues and civilian clothing, their faces hard and scarred by violence. These weren't opportunistic poachers hoping to make quick money. These were professionals, soldiers or mercenaries, and that made them infinitely more dangerous. The leader, a tall man with a jagged scar running from his left eye to his jaw, approached the silverback and nudged him with his boot. The gorilla didn't react, conserving what little strength he had left. The scarred man spoke to his companions, gesturing at the dead gorillas with casual indifference, as if they were nothing more than obstacles he'd cleared from a path. One of the other men, younger with nervous eyes, asked a question that made the leader laugh, a cold sound devoid of humor. Jake's Kinyarwanda was limited to basic greetings and market phrases, but he caught enough words to piece together the gist of their conversation. They were looking for the baby. They'd counted the family group before the attack and knew there should be 1 more gorilla, an infant. The young nervous one was worried about leaving witnesses, about someone finding the bodies and tracing them back to whoever had ordered this massacre. The leader told him not to worry. The forest would take care of the evidence. Scavengers would scatter the remains, and by the time anyone found this clearing, there'd be nothing left to investigate. But they still needed to find the baby. The scarred leader's voice took on an urgent tone as he explained something to his men. Jake caught the word proof repeated several times. They needed proof they'd killed the entire family. The baby gorilla's body was that proof, evidence they could take back to whoever had hired them for this atrocity. Without it, they wouldn't get paid in full. The mercenaries began spreading out, searching the clearing's perimeter, looking for signs of where the infant might have fled. Jake pressed himself deeper into the vegetation, the baby gorilla clutched against his chest. The little creature had gone completely still, its survival instincts overriding its fear. Jake could feel its heartbeat racing against his bare skin, a rapid flutter that matched his own pounding pulse. One of the mercenaries was moving toward their hiding spot, his rifle sweeping side to side as he searched. Jake's hand moved slowly to the knife on his belt. It was a pitiful weapon against automatic rifles, but if they discovered him, He'd fight with everything he had to protect this infant. The mercenary was less than 10 feet away now, close enough that Jake could see the man's finger resting on his rifle's trigger. Through the ferns, their eyes nearly met, and Jake held his breath, certain they'd been spotted. But then the scarred leader called out, his tone sharp and commanding. The mercenary turned away, responding to whatever order he'd been given. The three men converged at the far side of the clearing, examining something on the ground. Tracks, Jake realized. The baby's tracks leading away from the clearing in the wrong direction, away from where Jake and the infant were actually hiding. The silverback had done it. In his last moments of consciousness, the dying gorilla had deliberately dragged himself several feet, creating a false trail that led the mercenaries away from his baby's actual escape route. It was an act of supreme intelligence and paternal devotion, using his last strength not to save himself but to protect his child. Jake felt tears sting his eyes as he watched the great ape's chest rise and fall one final time, then go still. The silverback had died as he'd lived, defending his family to his very last breath. The mercenaries followed the false trail into the forest, their voices fading as they moved away from Jake and the baby's position. But the leader left one man behind to guard the clearing, a precaution in case the infant tried to return to its dead family members. The remaining guard lit a cigarette and settled against a tree, his rifle across his knees, clearly prepared for a long wait. Jake cursed silently. He needed to get the baby back to the ranch, to safety and medical attention. The little creature had cuts and scratches that needed treatment, and the psychological trauma it had endured would require expert care. But with a guard posted and the other mercenaries somewhere in the forest, escape seemed impossible. Jake assessed their options with the tactical mind of someone who'd spent years working dangerous situations on the ranch. They could wait for darkness, several hours away. They could try to circle wide around the clearing and hope to avoid detection. Or they could stay hidden and hope the mercenaries eventually gave up their search. None of the options were good, and all carried significant risk. The baby gorilla stirred in Jake's arms, its small hand reaching toward the clearing where its father's body lay. Jake gently restrained the movement, holding the infant close and whispering soothing words he hoped conveyed comfort if not meaning. "I know, little one. I know you want to go to him. But we can't. We have to stay quiet, stay hidden. Your daddy, he gave everything to keep you safe. We can't let that sacrifice be for nothing." The baby seemed to understand on some level, settling back against Jake's chest with small, heartbroken whimpers that it tried valiantly to suppress. Time crawled by with agonizing slowness. The guard finished his cigarette and lit another. Birds returned to the canopy above, their songs jarring in their normalcy after the violence that had shattered this place. Jake's legs cramped from holding his position, but he didn't dare move. The baby gorilla dozed fitfully, exhaustion finally overcoming its fear and grief. Jake envied the infant's ability to find even temporary escape in sleep. His own mind raced with questions and scenarios, trying to piece together why anyone would order the execution of an entire gorilla family. Mountain gorillas were worth far more alive than dead. Tourism centered on gorilla trekking brought millions of dollars into Rwanda's economy each year. The government protected them fiercely, and the penalties for killing them were severe. So why would someone risk international condemnation and serious legal consequences to murder a family group? It had to be about land, Jake reasoned. Everything in this part of the world eventually came down to land, mineral rights, or political power. Someone wanted this territory for something, and the gorillas were in the way. The sound of returning voices pulled Jake from his dark thoughts. The mercenaries were coming back, and from their angry tones, they hadn't found the baby. The scarred leader was furious, his voice rising as he berated his men for their failure. Jake caught fragments of the tirade. Their employer wouldn't accept excuses. They'd been paid to eliminate the entire family, and a living infant meant their job was incomplete. The leader made a decision. They'd burn the clearing, destroy the evidence, and tell their employer the baby had died in the fire. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than admitting they'd lost track of an infant gorilla. Panic surged through Jake as he watched one of the mercenaries pull out a container of fuel. Fire in this wet forest wouldn't spread far, but it would be enough to destroy the bodies, eliminate forensic evidence, and create a smokescreen that would make escape nearly impossible. The mercenaries began dousing the dead gorillas and surrounding vegetation with gasoline, the sharp chemical smell overwhelming the natural forest scents. Jake's mind raced. Once that fire started, the smoke would reveal their hiding position immediately. They had minutes at best to move. The baby gorilla tensed in Jake's arms, its nostrils flaring at the unfamiliar and threatening smell. Jake could feel the little creature's fear escalating, its breathing becoming rapid and shallow. He needed to move now, while the mercenaries were focused on their grim task, and before the infant's terror caused it to cry out. Jake carefully shifted his weight, testing each movement for sounds that might betray their position. The forest floor was mercifully damp, muffling the small noises of his repositioning. He plotted an escape route in his mind, a path that would take them deeper into the forest, away from both the mercenaries and the ranch. It was counterintuitive, moving away from safety, but trying to reach the ranch meant crossing the mercenaries' line of retreat. Better to circle wide through unknown territory than walk straight into their guns. Jake had always had a good sense of direction, a skill honed by years of working vast Montana rangeland where landmarks were scarce and getting lost could be fatal. The mercenaries were arguing now about how much fuel to use and whether the fire would attract unwanted attention from park rangers. Their distraction gave Jake the opening he needed. Moving with painstaking slowness, he eased himself and the baby gorilla away from their hiding spot, using the dense undergrowth as cover. Every few feet he paused, listening for any change in the mercenaries' conversation that might indicate they'd been spotted. The baby remained absolutely still, its small body rigid with instinctive understanding of the danger they faced. They'd made it perhaps 30 yards when Jake heard the distinctive scratch of a match being struck. He dropped flat behind a tangle of roots, pulling the baby down with him just as flames whooshed to life in the clearing. The mercenaries' voices rose in satisfaction, and through gaps in the vegetation, Jake could see orange flames climbing toward the canopy, consuming the evidence of their crime. The silverback's body was quickly obscured by smoke, and Jake felt a deep ache in his chest for the magnificent creature who had sacrificed everything for the small, trembling infant in his arms. The fire created exactly the chaos Jake needed. The mercenaries were focused on their blaze, making sure it caught properly, and destroyed what it needed to destroy. Jake used their distraction to put more distance between them, moving as quickly as he dared through the undergrowth. The baby gorilla clung to him with surprising strength, its small fingers digging into his shoulders. The little creature made no sound, but Jake could feel it shaking against him, traumatized beyond anything a young animal should have to endure. They'd been moving for perhaps 15 minutes when Jake heard a sound that made his blood freeze. Helicopter rotors. Someone was coming, and given the circumstances, it was unlikely to be friendly. The mercenaries heard it too. Their voices rose in alarm, shouting instructions to each other. The helicopter was approaching fast, flying low over the canopy. Jake caught glimpses of it through breaks in the trees, a civilian model but equipped with what looked like serious scanning equipment. Whoever had ordered the gorilla massacre was wealthy and well-connected enough to have aerial support. Jake changed direction again, heading toward a rocky outcropping he'd spotted through the trees. If they could reach it, the stone might provide cover from thermal imaging and other scanning technology. His rancher's knowledge of how cattle hid from aerial surveys was proving unexpectedly useful. Animals knew instinctively that stone retained different heat signatures than organic material and could mask body heat. He hoped the principle would work for humans and baby gorillas too. The outcropping was farther than it had appeared, and Jake's legs were burning with effort by the time they reached it. He found a shallow cave, little more than an overhang really, but it offered protection from above and concealment from ground level. He pressed himself and the baby into the deepest recess, arranging ferns and fallen branches to obscure the opening. The helicopter passed overhead twice, its rotors creating violent downdrafts that bent the trees and sent leaves swirling. Each time, Jake held his breath, certain they'd be spotted. But the stone worked its magic, and the helicopter continued its search pattern without stopping. The baby gorilla was shivering despite the warmth of the day, shock setting in from its ordeal. Jake needed to get the infant warm and calm, to prevent the physiological cascade that could prove as deadly as the mercenaries. He'd seen shock kill animals that had survived the initial trauma, their bodies simply giving up under the weight of stress and fear. He wrapped the baby in his torn shirt, creating a makeshift sling that held the little creature against his chest, where his body heat could help regulate its temperature. As Jake held the orphaned gorilla, his mind drifted to Sarah and the children they'd never had. They'd tried for years, enduring the heartbreak of miscarriages and the invasive procedures of fertility treatments. Sarah had died, still dreaming of the family they'd hoped to build, and Jake had buried that dream with her. Yet here he was, in a cave, on an African mountainside, cradling an infant that needed him desperately, that had chosen him as its protector. Life had a strange sense of irony. The helicopter made one final pass and then departed, the sound of its rotors fading into the distance. Jake waited another 30 minutes before daring to move, using the time to check the baby for injuries he might have missed. The little gorilla had superficial cuts and scrapes, probably from its desperate flight through the forest, but nothing that appeared life-threatening. Its eyes, however, held a depth of trauma that made Jake's chest tight. This baby had watched its entire family die, had understood on some level that it was alone in the world. The psychological scars would run deep. Jake pulled out his phone again, hoping distance from the clearing might improve reception. One bar flickered to life, weak but potentially usable. He composed a text to Dr. Mwangi, keeping it brief in case the signal dropped. Baby gorilla, family killed by mercenaries, armed men still searching, need extraction. His finger hovered over send, then paused. If the mercenaries were monitoring local communications, any message could give away their position. But without help, getting this infant to safety would be nearly impossible. He hit send and watched the message struggle to transmit. The bar flickered, disappeared, came back. After an agonizing minute, the text showed as delivered. Jake immediately powered down the phone to conserve battery and prevent it from being tracked. Now they had to wait and hope Dr. Mwangi received the message and could mobilize help. In the meantime, they needed to put more distance between themselves and the clearing. The mercenaries would eventually realize the fire hadn't consumed a baby gorilla's body, and they'd resume their search with renewed urgency. Jake emerged from the cave carefully, scanning the forest for any signs of movement before committing to the open. The baby gorilla had calmed somewhat, its breathing more regular, though it still trembled periodically. The little creature's dark eyes watched everything with unnerving intelligence, processing this nightmare it had been thrust into. Jake wondered what was going through that young mind, whether gorillas grieved the way humans did, whether this infant understood that its family was gone forever. They moved uphill, Jake's instincts telling him that higher ground would offer better vantage points and potentially better cell reception if he needed to contact Dr. Mwangi again. The volcanic soil was rich and dark, volcanic glass occasionally glinting in shafts of sunlight that penetrated the canopy. The forest here was primordial, unchanged for millennia, and Jake felt the weight of intruding on something ancient and sacred. These mountains had been home to gorillas long before humans arrived, and now humans were systematically destroying them for reasons that seemed incomprehensible. The baby gorilla suddenly stiffened in Jake's arms and made a soft hooting sound. Jake froze, every sense going on high alert. The infant was staring at something through the trees ahead, its small body tensed for flight. Jake followed the baby's gaze and felt his heart skip. Another gorilla was watching them from the shadows, a large female, possibly a blackback male. It was difficult to tell at this distance. The gorilla made no aggressive moves, simply observed them with that characteristic calm intelligence that made the species so remarkable. Jake stood absolutely still, remembering the protocols Dr. Mwangi had drilled into all ranch staff. Never make direct eye contact. Keep your posture relaxed and non-threatening. Move slowly, and give the gorilla space to retreat if it chooses. The baby in his arms began making soft vocalizations, sounds Jake had never heard before. They were plaintive and questioning, and to his amazement, the wild gorilla responded with similar calls. Some kind of communication was happening, a conversation in a language Jake couldn't begin to understand. The wild gorilla moved closer, each step deliberate and cautious. Jake's mouth went dry. This animal could kill him without effort if it perceived him as a threat to the infant. But something in the gorilla's demeanor suggested curiosity rather than aggression. The baby squirmed in Jake's arms, reaching toward the approaching gorilla with both hands. Jake's mind raced through options. Should he release the infant? Let it go to what might be a surviving family member, or hold on knowing the baby might be safer with humans given that armed mercenaries were hunting gorillas in this forest. The decision was made for him. The wild gorilla stopped about 10 feet away and sat down, a clear signal of non-aggression. Then it did something extraordinary. It looked directly at Jake, breaking the usual protocol of avoiding eye contact, and made a series of soft grunts while gesturing toward the baby. The meaning was unmistakable even across the species barrier. The gorilla was asking about the infant, wanting to know if it was safe, if it was hurt. The level of conscious concern took Jake's breath away. He slowly knelt, bringing the baby gorilla to ground level while keeping himself between the infant and the wild gorilla as a precautionary measure. The baby immediately tried to crawl toward its larger cousin or aunt or whatever relation this gorilla represented, but Jake held it gently back. "Not yet, little one. Let's make sure it's safe first." The wild gorilla watched this interaction with obvious intelligence, seeming to understand Jake's caution. It made more vocalizations, gentler now, clearly trying to reassure both human and infant. A crashing sound in the forest below shattered the moment, voices shouting in Kinyarwanda. The mercenaries had expanded their search pattern and were getting closer. The wild gorilla's head snapped toward the sound, and Jake saw fear flash across its expressive face. It knew those sounds meant danger, probably had encountered armed humans before. The gorilla looked at Jake one more time, a gaze loaded with meaning he struggled to interpret. Then it melted back into the forest, disappearing with the fluid grace that allowed these massive animals to move through dense vegetation like ghosts. Jake scooped up the baby and resumed his climb, moving faster now despite the increased risk of making noise. The mercenaries were close enough that he could hear individual words, and what he heard chilled him. They were coordinating a systematic sweep of the mountainside, creating a net that would eventually catch anything trying to escape toward the ranch. The helicopter was returning too, its distant rotors growing louder. Whoever wanted these gorillas dead had committed serious resources to ensuring the job was done completely. The terrain became rockier as they climbed, the soil giving way to volcanic stone that made footing treacherous. Jake's boots slipped on moss-covered surfaces, and twice he nearly fell, catching himself at the last second while protecting the baby gorilla from impact. The infant clung to him with desperate strength, its small fingers digging into his skin hard enough to bruise, but it made no sound, seeming to understand that silence was survival. They reached a ridgeline that offered a panoramic view of the forest below, and Jake's stomach dropped. He could see at least a dozen men spread out across the mountainside, moving in a coordinated pattern that spoke of military training. The helicopter hovered nearby, directing the search from above. These weren't just mercenaries. This was a professional operation, possibly involving former soldiers or active military personnel operating outside official channels. The implications were terrifying. This level of organization meant serious money and serious power behind the guerrilla killings. Jake spotted something else that made his pulse quicken. A thin column of smoke rising from the direction of the ranch. His first thought was that the mercenaries had attacked the facility, but the smoke was too controlled, too deliberate. Someone was signaling. Dr. Mwangi must have received his message and was marking a rally point for rescue, but the mercenaries had surely seen it too, and they'd know exactly what it meant. The baby gorilla tugged at Jake's arm and pointed toward a different direction entirely, away from both the ranch and the mercenaries. The little creature was insistent, making urgent sounds that suggested it knew something Jake didn't. For a moment, Jake hesitated. Every instinct told him to move toward the signal fire, toward human help and safety. But this infant had already proven itself remarkably intelligent. It had found Jake when it needed help. It had stayed silent when discovery meant death. Maybe it knew something about the terrain that could save them both. Jake made a choice that went against every logical impulse. He followed the baby's direction, trusting this young gorilla's instincts over his own rational mind. They moved along the ridgeline parallel to the mercenaries' search pattern, but staying above them on the high ground. The baby seemed to relax slightly once Jake committed to this course, as if it had been desperately hoping he'd listen. They traveled for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, the baby occasionally redirecting Jake with gentle touches and vocalizations. Then Jake saw where the infant was leading him, and he understood. Ahead, partially concealed by hanging vines and dense foliage, was the entrance to a lava tube, a natural tunnel formed millennia ago when molten rock had flowed down the mountainside. The baby gorilla made excited sounds and pointed emphatically at the dark opening. Jake approached cautiously, his rancher's practicality warring with the primal human fear of dark, confined spaces. But the baby was insistent, tugging at him with surprising strength for such a small creature. Jake pulled out his phone and used its flashlight to peer into the tunnel. The lava tube extended back into the mountain, its walls smooth and glassy from ancient heat. The floor was relatively level, covered in a thin layer of dirt and organic debris that had accumulated over countless years. Most importantly, it would be invisible from aerial surveillance and nearly impossible to search systematically without knowing it existed. The baby gorilla had led him to the perfect hiding place, knowledge it could only have acquired through previous experience. This wasn't random. The infant's family must have used this tube as shelter during storms or as a refuge from predators. They entered the tunnel, and Jake felt the temperature drop immediately. The volcanic rock retained the coolness of the mountain's interior, creating a natural refrigeration that was welcome after the humid heat of the forest. His phone light revealed that the tube extended at least 50 feet before curving out of sight. The baby gorilla moved confidently into the darkness, clearly familiar with this space. Jake followed, ducking his head to avoid low spots in the ceiling where solidified lava had formed strange, organic-looking protrusions. About 30 feet in, the tube opened into a larger chamber where multiple lava flows had intersected, creating a space roughly the size of a small room. The baby gorilla immediately went to one corner and began making soft, mournful sounds. Jake shone his light there and felt his throat tighten. Nesting materials, carefully arranged vegetation that showed the deliberate work of intelligent hands. This had been the family's sleeping area, a safe haven they'd used regularly. The baby was home, but home was now empty of everyone it had loved. Jake sat down heavily on a flat rock, the full weight of the day's events finally crashing over him. He'd witnessed a massacre, fled from armed mercenaries, been hunted by helicopter, and was now hiding in a volcanic cave with an orphaned gorilla infant. Nothing in his Montana ranching background had prepared him for this situation. He thought about Sarah, wondering what she would have made of all this. She'd always been braver than him, more willing to take risks for something that mattered. She would have told him he was doing the right thing, protecting the helpless regardless of the danger to himself. The baby gorilla climbed into Jake's lap, seeking comfort in the only remaining source available. The little creature's trust was both humbling and terrifying. Jake wrapped his arms around the infant, feeling its rapid heartbeat begin to slow as it felt safe for perhaps the first time since the attack. They sat together in the dim light of the phone, two utterly different beings united by circumstance and loss. Jake found himself talking to the baby, his voice echoing softly off the volcanic walls. "I know you miss them. I know this hurts more than anything you've ever felt. I lost someone too, someone who meant everything to me. Her name was Sarah, and she was the best part of my life. When she died, I thought I'd never feel anything again except this emptiness. I came to Africa to run away from that pain, to lose myself in work hard enough to keep me from thinking. But you know what? You can't run from grief. It follows you wherever you go. The only thing that helps is finding something worth living for, something that needs you as much as you need it." The baby gorilla looked up at him with those impossibly expressive eyes, and Jake could have sworn the little creature understood every word. Maybe not the specific meaning, but the emotion behind them, the shared experience of loss and the desperate search for meaning in the aftermath. Jake's phone buzzed suddenly, making them both jump. A text message from Dr. Mwangi had somehow found signal despite their location in the lava tube. Her message was brief but loaded with information. Rangers notified, military aware of situation, stay hidden, extraction team coming at dawn. Your location? Jake considered his response carefully. The mercenaries might be monitoring communications using signal triangulation to track phones, but Dr. Mwangi needed to know where to send help. He composed a vague message. In volcanic shelter north of incident site. Baby safe. Armed hostiles still active. Send coordinates to this number only when extraction team ready. He powered down the phone again immediately after sending, not waiting for a response. Darkness was falling outside, the quality of light filtering into the lava tube changing from green gold to deep purple. Jake hadn't eaten since breakfast, and his stomach growled in protest. The baby gorilla must be hungry too, but there was nothing Jake could offer except water from a small stream that trickled through one section of the tube. He guided the infant to the water, showing it how to cup its hands and drink. The baby copied his movements with touching precision, its learning ability remarkable even under such traumatic circumstances. As night settled over the mountain, Jake positioned himself near the tube's entrance where he could watch for approaching threats while remaining concealed. The baby gorilla curled up against his side, one small hand clutching his belt as if afraid he might disappear. Jake found himself thinking about the silverback's final moments, the way he'd used his last strength to protect his child. That magnificent creature had looked at Jake with dying eyes and entrusted him with the most precious thing in his world. It was a responsibility Jake had never asked for, but one he now carried with absolute commitment. The night forest came alive with sounds that were alien to Jake's Montana-trained ears. Strange birds called in the darkness. Insects created symphonies of clicks and chirps, and occasionally he heard larger movements that might have been other gorillas or might have been something more dangerous. The mercenaries would have difficulty operating effectively in this terrain after dark, but they might use night vision equipment to continue their search. Jake remained vigilant, his hand never far from his knife, though he knew it would be useless against automatic weapons. Around midnight, the baby gorilla woke from a nightmare, crying out in distress. Jake held the infant close, rocking gently and making soothing sounds until the little creature calmed. It broke his heart to think about what images must be playing through that young mind, what terrors were being relived in sleep. The baby had witnessed horrors that would traumatize a human child for life. How did a gorilla process such trauma? Did they have the psychological mechanisms to heal from this kind of loss? Dawn broke with agonizing slowness, the darkness gradually giving way to gray light that filtered into the lava tube. Jake had dozed fitfully throughout the night, never fully sleeping, always alert for sounds of danger. The baby gorilla had finally fallen into deeper sleep around 3 a.m, exhausted by trauma and stress. Jake had used those quiet hours to think through everything that had happened, trying to piece together the larger picture of why someone would orchestrate such a brutal attack on an endangered gorilla family. The answer, when it came to him, was both simple and horrifying. Land. This mountainside sat on the border between the national park and private property. If someone could prove the gorillas had abandoned this territory, moved deeper into the park, then the land protections could potentially be challenged. Dead gorillas couldn't testify to their historical use of the area. It was a strategy born of greed and enabled by corruption, using murder to circumvent conservation laws that stood in the way of development or resource extraction. Jake powered on his phone at first light, hoping for communication from Dr. Mwangi. The device immediately buzzed with multiple messages, all from the same number. The extraction team was ready, waiting for coordinates. A helicopter would come in fast, land just long enough to retrieve them and get out before the mercenaries could respond. But Jake needed to provide an exact location, and he needed to get the baby gorilla to a pickup point that a helicopter could access. The lava tube was perfect for hiding, but impossible for aerial extraction. He studied the terrain through the tube entrance, looking for potential landing zones. About 200 yards upslope, he could see a rocky plateau that looked relatively flat and clear of vegetation. It would be exposed and dangerous, but it was their best option. Jake sent the coordinates along with a message indicating they'd need 20 minutes to reach the extraction point. The response came back immediately. Extraction team inbound. Hot 40 minutes, be ready. The baby gorilla woke and seemed to sense the change in Jake's energy. The little creature watched him with alert eyes as he prepared for their dash to the plateau. Jake had no weapons except his knife, no real plan except to run and hope they reached the helicopter before the mercenaries found them. He thought about the wild gorilla they'd encountered yesterday, wondered if it had survived the night, if others in the area were also being hunted. This massacre might be just one part of a larger operation to clear the mountainside of its protected inhabitants. Jake checked his watch. They had 15 minutes before they needed to move. He used the time to scout the immediate area around the lava tube, looking for signs of mercenary activity. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the usual wildlife was avoiding the area. That could mean human presence nearby, or simply the lingering effects of yesterday's violence. Animals were sensitive to death and danger, and this whole section of forest had been soaked in both. The baby gorilla refused to be put down, clinging to Jake with desperate strength. The infant had apparently decided that this human was now its primary attachment figure, the only source of safety in a world that had become terrifyingly dangerous. Jake adjusted the makeshift sling he'd created from his torn shirt, securing the baby against his chest where it couldn't fall if he needed to run. The little creature's heartbeat against his skin was a constant reminder of what was at stake. At the designated time, Jake emerged from the lava tube and began moving upslope toward the plateau. He moved quickly but carefully, using cover where available and pausing frequently to listen for threats. The baby gorilla remained silent, seeming to understand the need for stealth. Jake's respect for the infant's intelligence grew with each passing hour. This wasn't a mindless animal operating on pure instinct. This was a thinking, feeling being capable of complex reasoning and emotional depth. They were halfway to the plateau when Jake heard the helicopter. It was still distant but approaching fast, the distinctive whoop-whoop of rotors echoing off the volcanic peaks. But there was another sound too, one that made his blood freeze. Voices below them, moving upslope. The mercenaries were between them and escape. The helicopter's noise must have drawn them, making them realize that rescue was imminent. They were moving to intercept, to ensure no witnesses escaped to tell what had happened in this forest. Jake abandoned stealth for speed, running upslope as fast as the terrain allowed. The baby gorilla bounced against his chest, making small, distressed sounds, but holding on tight. Behind them, the voices grew louder, more urgent. The mercenaries had spotted them. Jake heard shouting, then the sharp crack of rifle fire. Bullets whipped through the air around them, striking trees and sending chips of volcanic rock flying. Jake zigzagged instinctively, making himself a harder target while protecting the baby with his body. The plateau was tantalizingly close now, just 50 yards ahead. The helicopter appeared over the ridgeline, a civilian model painted in the bright colors of the conservation organization. But it was taking fire from the mercenaries below, the pilot fighting to maintain position while bullets pinged off the aircraft's hull. Jake saw someone in the helicopter's open door, Dr. Mwangi herself, waving frantically for him to hurry. The pilot was holding position despite the danger, buying Jake precious seconds to close the distance. 30 yards, 20. Jake's lungs burned and his legs screamed in protest, but he pushed harder, driven by pure determination. The baby gorilla's small fingers dug into his shoulders, the little creature's terror palpable. More gunfire erupted from below, a sustained barrage that seemed designed to either kill them or drive the helicopter away. Jake heard the distinctive ping of a bullet striking the helicopter's tail rotor, heard the pilot curse over the engine noise. They were running out of time. 10 yards from the helicopter, Jake felt something punch him in the left shoulder, an impact followed by searing pain. He'd been shot. His arm went numb and his stride faltered, but he didn't stop. The baby gorilla was crying now, sensing Jake's injury, but it held on with undiminished strength. Dr. Mwangi was leaning out of the helicopter, her arm extended, screaming for him to move faster. Jake gathered the last of his strength and lunged forward, practically throwing himself at the helicopter. Strong hands grabbed him, hauling him and the baby gorilla into the aircraft. The pilot didn't wait, pulling pitch even before Jake was fully inside, the helicopter lurching into the air as more bullets hammered its fuselage. Jake felt the baby gorilla being carefully pried from his chest, heard Dr. Mwangi's voice giving rapid instructions to her team. Someone was pressing gauze to his shoulder, trying to slow the bleeding, while others were examining the baby for injuries. The flight to the ranch took less than 10 minutes, but to Jake, it felt like an eternity. His shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, and he could feel blood soaking through the makeshift bandages. But his eyes never left the baby gorilla, watching as Dr. Mwangi examined the infant with expert hands, checking for wounds, assessing its condition, speaking softly in both English and what Jake assumed was Kinyarwanda. The baby kept reaching toward Jake, making distressed vocalizations whenever the distance between them grew too great. "He's bonded to you, Doctor," Mwangi said, her voice carrying both wonder and concern. "In all my years working with gorillas, I've never seen an infant attached to a human this quickly or this completely. The trauma has made you his sole source of security. We'll need to be very careful how we handle the separation." Jake wanted to ask what separation she meant, but his vision was starting to blur at the edges, shock and blood loss finally catching up with him. He tried to focus on the baby, on those dark eyes that held so much trust and need, but darkness was creeping in from the periphery. The helicopter landed hard on the ranch's emergency pad, and Jake was immediately surrounded by people. Someone lifted him onto a stretcher, while others whisked the baby gorilla away toward the veterinary clinic. Jake tried to protest, tried to keep the infant in sight, but his body was no longer responding to his commands. The last thing he remembered before unconsciousness claimed him was the baby's crying, a heartbroken sound that seemed to echo the loss of yet another protector, and Dr. Mwangi's calm voice assuring the little creature that Jake would be fine, that they'd see each other again soon. Jake woke in a clean bed with crisp white sheets, sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked the familiar pastures of the ranch. His left shoulder was heavily bandaged, and an IV drip fed fluids into his right arm. Dr. Mwangi sat in a chair beside his bed, working on a laptop, but clearly keeping watch. She looked up when Jake stirred, relief washing over her features. "Welcome back, Mr. Carson. You've been out for about 8 hours. The bullet went clean through your shoulder, missed major arteries and bone. You were very lucky." "The baby," Jake croaked, his throat dry as dust. "Where is he?" Dr. Mwangi smiled and gestured toward a corner of the room that Jake couldn't see from his angle. "He's right here. Wouldn't leave your side once we finished treating him. I had to bring him into the recovery room because he was making himself sick with stress." She moved aside, and Jake saw a small enclosure that had been set up near his bed. The baby gorilla was curled up inside, watching Jake with alert, worried eyes. The moment their gazes met, the infant made soft, relieved sounds and reached through the enclosure bars toward him. Jake tried to sit up, wincing at the pain in his shoulder. Dr. Mwangi helped him adjust his position so he could see the baby better. The infant looked cleaner now, its fur washed free of mud and blood, small bandages covering the cuts and scrapes it had sustained during its ordeal, but the emotional wounds were clearly deeper. The baby's eyes held a wariness that shouldn't exist in something so young, a knowledge of death and loss that had aged it beyond its years. "I'm here, little one," Jake said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." Dr. Mwangi opened the enclosure and the baby gorilla immediately scrambled out, climbing onto Jake's bed with surprising gentleness, as if aware of his injury. The infant settled against Jake's good side, one small hand resting on his chest, monitoring his heartbeat. The trust implicit in that gesture made Jake's throat tight with emotion. This little creature had lost everything, yet it still had the capacity to trust, to bond, to hope for safety and care. The resilience was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Over the next hour, Dr. Mwangi filled Jake in on everything that had happened while he was unconscious. The massacre site had been secured by park rangers and Rwandan military. The evidence Jake had helped preserve by keeping the baby safe had proven crucial. Forensic teams had recovered bullets, shell casings, and other evidence that pointed to a sophisticated operation. The mercenaries had scattered after the helicopter extraction, but several had been captured at roadblocks set up around the mountain. They were talking, trying to reduce their sentences by providing information about who had hired them. The story emerging was exactly what Jake had suspected. A mining company with connections to powerful government officials had wanted to exploit mineral deposits on the mountainside. The guerrillas' protected status and their use of the area made mining legally impossible, so someone had decided to eliminate the problem permanently, kill the guerrillas, destroy the evidence, and claim the land had been abandoned. It was a scheme born of greed and enabled by corruption at the highest levels. The international outcry was already building, conservation organizations and foreign governments demanding accountability. But for Jake, the larger political implications seemed distant and abstract compared to the small, breathing reality pressed against his side. This baby gorilla represented something more than just evidence or a symbol of conservation. It was a living being that had chosen to trust him, that had led him into danger and out again, that had shown intelligence and courage beyond what most people attributed to animals. Jake had spent 3 years in Africa trying to escape his past, working to forget the pain of loss. Now he found himself responsible for a creature that embodied loss, that needed him not despite his broken past, but perhaps because of it. Dr. Mwangi watched the interaction between man and infant with scientific interest and unmistakable emotion. "He's going to need long-term care," she said quietly. "Psychological rehabilitation as much as physical. Infant gorillas who lose their families often fail to thrive, even with the best veterinary attention. They need consistent attachment figures, stable relationships. The rehabilitation center can provide that, but it would help immensely if he had someone he'd already bonded with involved in his care." She left the implication hanging in the air. Jake looked down at the baby gorilla, at those eyes that watched him with such trust and need. His contract with the ranch was month to month. He could leave whenever he wanted, return to Montana, or move on to another adventure in another country. He'd spent 3 years avoiding permanent attachments, convinced that caring deeply only led to devastating loss. But this little creature didn't care about his fear or his past. It simply needed him, had chosen him as its anchor in a world that had become terrifyingly uncertain. The question wasn't whether Jake could afford to stay. It was whether he could afford to leave. "I'll stay," Jake said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. "Whatever he needs, however long it takes, I'll help him through this." Dr. Mwangi's smile was radiant with relief and approval. "I was hoping you'd say that. We'll set you up in one of the rehabilitation cottages once you're mobile again. You'll work directly with our primate team, learn proper care protocols, become certified in gorilla rehabilitation. It's not easy work, Jake. It will challenge everything you think you know about animals and your own emotional capacity, but I believe you're exactly what this little one needs." The baby gorilla, as if understanding that a crucial decision had just been made, snuggled deeper against Jake's side with a contented sigh that sounded remarkably human. Jake rested his good hand on the infant's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of its breathing. For the first time in 3 years since the moment he'd gotten the call about Sarah's accident, Jake felt something other than the hollow numbness that had become his constant companion. He felt needed. He felt purposeful. He felt like maybe, just maybe, his life still had meaning beyond simply existing from one day to the next. Over the following weeks, as Jake's shoulder healed and his strength returned, he threw himself into learning everything about gorilla care and rehabilitation. Dr. Mwangi and her team were patient teachers guiding him through the complexities of primate nutrition, social development, and psychological needs. The baby gorilla, whom Jake had started calling Sam after his own father, proved to be both a demanding and rewarding student. The little ape was intelligent beyond anything Jake had imagined, learning quickly and showing remarkable emotional intelligence. The bond between them deepened in ways that surprised everyone, including Jake himself. Sam refused to sleep unless Jake was nearby, would become anxious if separated for more than a few hours, and showed clear preference for Jake's company over anyone else's. The rehabilitation team documented their relationship with fascination, noting how Sam's trauma responses decreased dramatically when Jake was present. It was unprecedented for a wild gorilla infant to attach so completely to a human, but the circumstances had been unprecedented as well. 3 months after the massacre, the news broke internationally. The mining company's involvement was exposed through the testimony of captured mercenaries and forensic evidence from the crime scene. High-ranking government officials were implicated in the conspiracy, leading to resignations and arrests that shook Rwanda's political establishment. The global conservation community rallied around the story, using it to push for stronger protections for mountain gorillas and harsher penalties for those who would harm them. The 3 dead gorillas and the silverback who had died protecting his family became symbols of what was being lost in the name of greed and development. Jake found himself thrust into the spotlight, his role in saving Sam and preserving evidence making him a reluctant hero. News crews came to the ranch, wanting interviews and footage of the cowboy who had risked his life for a baby gorilla. Jake hated the attention, but Dr. Mwangi convinced him that his story could help raise awareness and funding for conservation efforts. So he endured the cameras and questions, always making sure Sam was nearby, always redirecting focus to the larger issues of habitat protection and the need to value gorillas as the remarkable beings they were. Sam grew stronger and more confident with each passing day. The rehabilitation team slowly introduced him to other young gorillas at the facility, carefully monitored socialization sessions designed to ensure he didn't lose his species identity while maintaining his bond with Jake. It was a delicate balance, and there were setbacks. Sam would sometimes wake screaming from nightmares, reliving the trauma of that terrible day, but Jake was always there, holding the little gorilla through the fear, speaking softly until the terror passed and sleep returned. 6 months after their harrowing escape from the mountain, Jake stood on the porch of his cottage watching Sam play with 2 other juvenile gorillas in the large outdoor enclosure. The baby, who had been so traumatized and afraid, had blossomed into a confident, playful young ape who could hold his own in gorilla social dynamics. He still looked for Jake frequently, making eye contact across the distance to ensure his human was still there, still watching, still present. And Jake always was. Dr. Mwangi joined Jake on the porch, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression that was part pride, part melancholy. "He's doing remarkably well," she observed. "Better than I dared hope when you first brought him to us. You've given him something I couldn't have provided through veterinary care alone. You've given him love and stability and a reason to trust that the world can be safe again." Jake watched Sam execute a perfect chest-beating display that made the other juveniles scatter in mock fear, then dissolve into play wrestling. The sight made him smile, something he did regularly now, an expression that had been rare in the years since Sarah's death. "He gave me the same things," Jake admitted quietly. "I came to Africa running from pain, convinced I'd never care about anything or anyone again. Then this little guy showed up, crying and covered in blood, begging me to help. He saved me as much as I saved him." Dr. Mwangi nodded with understanding. "That's how it works sometimes. We think we're rescuing them, but they're the ones doing the rescuing." She paused, then added, "We've been talking about your future here, Jake. How would you feel about a permanent position as head of our primate rehabilitation program? You've proven yourself beyond anything we could have hoped for." Jake felt his chest tighten with emotion. His contract had been temporary, a way station on a journey to nowhere in particular, but somewhere along the line this place had become home. These gorillas had become his purpose, and Sam, that remarkable little ape who had trusted a stranger with his life and his heart, had become family in a way Jake had never expected to experience again. "I'd like that," he said simply. "I'd like that very much." That evening, as the sun set over the Virunga Mountains, painting the volcanic peaks in shades of orange and gold, Jake sat in Sam's enclosure during the final feeding of the day. The young gorilla ate his dinner messily, occasionally offering Jake pieces of fruit with the generous impulse of a toddler sharing toys. Jake accepted each offering solemnly, touched by the simple gesture of affection and trust. When dinner was finished, Sam climbed into Jake's lap, settling against his chest with a contentment that spoke of complete security. Jake thought about the morning Sam had appeared out of the mist, desperate and afraid, begging for help with every fiber of his being. He thought about the silverback's dying eyes, the trust implicit in that final gaze. He thought about Sarah and the life they'd planned that would never be, and he thought about the unexpected life he'd found here in Africa, caring for an orphaned gorilla who had chosen him as a father figure. Life had a way of surprising you, of taking tragedy and somehow transforming it into purpose if you were brave enough to accept the gifts that came wrapped in pain. Sam yawned widely, his small hand finding Jake's and holding on as sleep began to claim him. In the distance, Jake could hear other gorillas calling to each other in the forest, the wild relatives of the orphans at the rehabilitation center. Someday, if all went well, Sam would join them, released back into the wild where he belonged. It would be bittersweet letting go of this little creature who had become so precious. But Jake understood that love sometimes meant giving someone the freedom to become what they were meant to be, even if it meant separation. For now, though, they had this moment, this evening on an African mountainside with the sun setting and a baby gorilla sleeping trustingly in his arms. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything Jake had needed without knowing he needed it. As darkness settled over the ranch and the stars began to appear in the vast African sky, Jake whispered a promise to the sleeping infant, to the silverback who had entrusted him with this precious life, and to himself. "I've got you, little one. I'll always have you, and whatever comes next, we'll face it together." The baby gorilla's breathing deepened into true sleep, and Jake sat holding him as night embraced the mountain. Two souls who had found each other in tragedy and chosen to build something beautiful from the ruins of loss. Thank you for following this incredible journey. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe for more amazing animal stories. And remember, sometimes the most extraordinary connections happen when we're brave enough to answer the call for help, no matter how unexpected the source.